Hey Dave, morning. How you doing? Welcome to the Changemakers.
Hi, Dave. Good to be here.
Awesome, awesome. Um, so you and I, we've kind of already had a bulk of this chat, haven't we? I think we met
Yeah.
over coffee just down the road. It's so refreshing to be interviewing, chatting with someone who works in the same field, but locally, And it's an absolute pleasure, to be honest with you. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast as well. Really, really good to have you on board. And I love these chats because so often on the podcast we've talked about something really, really specific. It could be product marketing, it could be brand. There's very specific topics that we tend to stick to. But sometimes the best conversations are just kind of about a life in design, if you like, or a life in the world of brand. So these conversations are always good ones, and I really, really want to get into this with you. And what better place to start if we could with just a whistle-stop tour, if I can, of your life in design so far, your career in design so far.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's interesting how we met actually, because I went to the Shaped by webinar series that you guys did. It was all about creative and B2B. Big recommendation on that. Some really great content. And I kind of thought that you guys were based in the US for some reason. And when I kind of looked into it, I realized you were 15 minutes down the road. So that was when we met. Yeah, but really, really great to be on this podcast, and some of the other guys that you've had on, some of the other subjects have been really fascinating. So yeah, as far as my career goes, I think probably the story that I want to tell is all about a winding path in a creative career and some kind of coincidences and things that I've moved into, strange sort of periods in my life. But yeah, my story started I grew up in Cornwall, and it was quite a dull cultural environment that I grew up in. It was quite a rainy, drizzly Cornish town. But in my house, I was fortunate to grow up in a very creative environment, and it was I think the important thing was it was a creative but very industrious creative environment. So it wasn't kind of bohemian creative. My dad was an artist, so he was a painter, and he started his career as a teacher, an art teacher, and one day he decided to pack it in and become a painter. And my mother supported him, very important. Probably a subject we'll get back to at some point is the importance of support in a creative career. And she said, "We'll do it." And he figured out how many paintings he needed to make and sell in order to live, in order to pay the bills.
How many was that, roughly?
I can't remember. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think he started and he worked. He used to work in the loft of our house, and I didn't know this at the time, obviously, because I was really young. But he used to work all night, so he'd be painting all night.
Wow.
And yeah, he was fortunate to come across this guy who worked in television, and his wife is one of these weird things about coincidences and that kind of thing. This guy's wife went to an art gallery, small art gallery. My dad had some paintings, mentioned them to this guy. He went along and saw them, really liked them, and he was like, "Great, I'm going to do a documentary on this local artist." So he was really my dad's kind of benefactor and launched his career, and that was it. So I grew up in a household, way before working from home was a thing. My dad was at home all the time in his studio painting. And yeah, like I say, it was kind of weird. I think the rest of my family as well, one of my uncles was a leather craftsman. He used to make gun belts, like Western gun belts and saddles and that kind of thing. And he lived
in Cornwall.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he lived in Bristol in this house. We go and see him, and he used to have kind of like, a massive Wild West saddle that he'd been working on in the middle of his living room. And my other uncle was a builder, and he would buy houses, move into them, do them up, and then sell them. So when we were kids, we were surrounded by these very individual, very self-sufficient people that earned money from their own ideas and their own kind of craft. So I didn't have that thing that other creatives have, where they have parents who maybe work in an office and they say, you can't be a creative, you can't be an artist, you need to find a proper job. It was pretty understood and very reasonable for say, yeah, you can make your way and make money from, thoughts in your head turned into things that people will buy, and it's probably testament to that my two brothers, my older brother's a writer and he's published a lot of novels, and my younger brother is a design engineer. So we've all kind of gone down those paths. And for a long time, when I was a freelancer, I didn't have a boss. My older brother doesn't have a boss. He gets work through his agent. And my younger brother's a contractor. So all very kind of independent in terms of like how we've worked. And one of the things I think growing up, we had this kind of industrious creative, it was one of my takeaways was it's hard. If you're going to be a creative, you have to put in the hours. And my dad put in the hours, and, there would be things like if he was struggling with a particular composition, then he'd be very quiet for a couple of days. And we were like, right, he's trying to get the tree right or the smoke, in the scene. So it was that idea that being a creative was an actual not a 9 to 5 thing, but it was a job that you put in the hours with, that you had to work at, you had to craft. And then the other thing I think was brands. And because I was in this slightly grey, drizzly Cornish town, there were a few things that were like these little chinks of light, and one of them was brands. And I was obsessed from a kid by TV commercials. There was a lot of film in my house. So we would watch, Guns of Navarone and Zulu, all these kind of big sort of epics, and Elmer Bernstein scores and that kind of stuff, and John Barry. James Bond was a big one as well. And I remember my dad made this VHS cassette of all of the James Bond titles that I just became completely obsessed with. And that was a running thing. And I've always been really interested in this shorthand visual summary of things. So I regularly watch movie trailers. I'm obsessed with movie trailers. Like, how do they tell the story of the film in that amount of time?
Yeah.
And then like MTV music videos as well later on. And one of the things that, faced with this grey surroundings, me and my brothers used to play a lot of role-playing games. And looking back on it, that was a creative 101. I mean, I used to build sailing ships out of cardboard boxes. My brother would write these incredible campaigns with characters and backstories. We used to invent characters and weapons and buildings, all kinds of things, and draw them. And amazing. Probably a couple of years that we did that. And then I went into computer games, the first kind of ZX Spectrums that came out and all that kind of stuff. And I think that was probably the first brush with startup culture as well, because it was a time when there were a lot of young guys, like codemasters, setting up these software houses where they'd make these games. And, they're all buying Ferraris and that kind of thing. Sort of interesting times. And then I left. I always wanted to get away. I knew that I wanted to get away for sure. And I remember there was a railway line at the bottom near my house where there was an express train that used to go to London at night. And I used to stare out my bedroom window and look at the lights of this train, going, thinking, I want to be on that train. I want to be, go into the big city. And my first thing that I latched onto really was photography. And that was my creative output. I wanted to be a photographer. I wanted to be, more concretely, a war photographer. That was my idea. I became really obsessed with like Don McCullin and the whole Vietnam era, Apocalypse Now and Vietnam movies and that kind of thing. And I was interested in how photography had played such a big part in changing people's perceptions of the war and that kind of thing, just through these images. And I remember
I had this in an educational setting, like courses and things like that, or was this just purely passion?
It was purely passion. I did a really strange photography course. I went to a sixth form college and did I think I did politics and history or something. And then I went to a college next door which was a bit more kind of vocational courses, and they had a photography course, and the tutor was an alcoholic, and a lot of the time, he's a nice guy, a lot of the time he was completely wasted when he would turn up to do these lessons, but he had a big sort of photography lab full of gear, and we used to just get on with it, and we had these big plate cameras that we'd mess around with making images, and I learned how to develop film in a dark room, which is really interesting. So I liked the technical side and the chemicals and the process, as well as the creative side. And making pictures in a dark room is amazing. You know, if anyone who's ever done it, you put your image into a developer tray and it appears incredible. So off I went. I think I was barely 18, and I signed up for this degree course in Brighton, which was a new one. And it was great because all of my all of my career has been pretty unconventional. For some reason, I've always ended up in quite unconventional places. And this course was new, and they had a real random bunch of students. I was the youngest, and then it went up to about 50. 50 years of age was the oldest one, and there was a whole jumble of different people on it. People who didn't come from backgrounds which would normally lead them to go to university. There was an ex-army guy who'd worked in military intelligence as a photographer and then wanted to go into kind of being a professional photographer. A really kind of interesting bunch of people. And around about that time previous to that, actually, before I'd gone away to university, this was the big boom of rave culture. And that landed in Cornwall in this small club that we started to go to. And it was a family pub, and it's still there. And round the back, the owner had a small nightclub, and he was obviously like some Aphex Twin was one of the local DJs, like early days. So obviously there were some local promoters, these kids who'd got together and said, "Hey, can we put on some club nights in your club?" And he was like, "Yeah, sure." Unbeknown to him, coaches from Manchester would turn up, and this was incredible for me, because straight away I was out of this kind of bubble of Cornwall, and that I was getting all these outside influences. So that music and that whole kind of wave of culture really interested me. And when I was at university, I started to get into people like Future Sound of London, who were using visuals, and there was a mash of things all of a sudden. It wasn't just about the images, it was about images and motion and type and that kind of thing. I got really into record cover design. I think that was probably my first thing where I was actually collecting things, and there was some crazy stuff happening with 12, and it was 12-inch as well, so it was a big canvas. You get these amazing things. And so after university, I just went up to London. I went around all kinds of magazines like Dazed and Confused, and I just knocked on doors. It was the thing. The thing then was, when you leave university, get a portfolio, knock on doors. So I did. I knocked on a lot of doors, and I went to a lot of places. And I wound up at a drum and bass label in London. Really nice guy, got me in, looked through my strange portfolio and said, "Yeah, we'll have a couple of these images to put on some covers." And I was like, "Wow." And that was that. And then I remember when they came out, I didn't like the type. And I thought, yeah, this is as a thing, my image looks great, but I'd really like to know how to put the type on, because that is something that's adding to it, but I don't know how to do that bit, and I'd just be really interested. So I just turned up at a design studio, a really small design studio. They didn't do record covers, but I wanted to learn how to use computers. I wanted to learn how to use Macs. And it was kind of early days Photoshop. So when I did my degree course, we learned how to spot images by hand. And spotting images where if you have a tiny scratch on a negative and you make a print, black and white, you'll have a tiny mark. And we learned how to spot these, to get rid of the marks with ink and a sable brush, which is the most insane. I've done a lot of things through my career where I've thought, this as a process is insane, and one day will be replaced. And it obviously did. So when Photoshop came out, I still use the patch tool and everything with moments of joy, thinking about, when I learned how to do that stuff by hand. But I really wanted to learn how to use Macs. I didn't know how to do it because I'd done my degree. At that time I was teaching photography. I was a kind of youth leader, and I used to go around community centres in the UK doing these little mini photography courses, which was a lot of fun. But I wanted to get into the computer side of things. So I just turned up at a studio and said, I'll do anything you want for free, as long as you give me the keys to the studio and let me stay here late figuring out how to work a Mac. So that's what I did for about a year and a half. And just terrible early sort of forays into design. I didn't know what I was doing. Some of it, yeah. I just moved house, and I've got a big box of old work that I went through. That was really interesting because I don't often look at things that I've done before. I'll just do something and then move on to the next thing. Sometimes I see something that I forget that I've done, and I think, oh, that's really good, and then I realize I've done it. It sounds a bit bizarre, but it does happen. And then from that studio, I realized that I wasn't ever going to get paid. And by then I kind of knew enough. I did things like take film to the printers, and I started to copy check for them because they used to do a lot of print publication. And back in those days, it makes me sound about 300 years old, but back in those days, it was literally film, and you would hold the film to light and scan. Really, really good for detail, learning how to spot detail and things and errors. But I realized I probably wasn't going to get paid. And a friend of mine said, oh, there's a studio in town, and this was in Brighton, who are looking for a studio manager. So I went along to see them, and it was a small studio called Red Design. And one of the partners, of two of them, one of the partners, Hamish McGill, who went on to set up Studio McGill. And they were like, yeah, we need someone to organize the office, do the invoicing, all that stuff, and we'll pay you X amount. And I was like, yes. And I think I showed them my design work at the time, so I can do this. And they just come out, They didn't say too much about it. It was good. But they had a lot of clients in the music industry. So they used to work with Skint Records and Fatboy Slim and Damien Harris, who was running Skint Records at the time. And it was interesting because it felt like a small community of artists, but they had a massive national, global even impact. And I was so I was the studio manager. So I would do invoicing, and I would chase up unpaid invoices. And I enjoyed it all, actually. I wasn't necessarily doing anything creative, but they did start to use some of my photography on covers and that kind of thing. And I just learned some really interesting things about how a business works, and especially with the design. And I think that probably the fortunate thing was I was getting the tail, because I hadn't studied design. I didn't know anything about design. I was literally just teaching myself and just learning from watching them. And they were great teachers because they'd obviously, been up through that, Neville Brody and all that kind of stuff, and David Carson. And it was a time when graphic design was still manual. And when I was using Photoshop, I remember one of them said to me, don't touch that tab at the top. And it was the filter section, crazy to think about that now, where everyone just heads straight for that stuff. But yeah, it was making things with scanners, printing things out, setting fire to them, scanning them, all of that kind of stuff. We used a lot of sellotape and a lot of scalpels and all of those things. And I was given my first design job, which was a club flyer. So there was a client who used to do drum and bass nights. And they said, right, you can do these flyers for this guy. And I just threw myself into that. And that was a real education. I remember once I was working on one, and one of the partners walked past and said, that looks really good. I was like, yeah, yes, going really well. And he said, how long have you spent on it? And I said, oh, I don't know, about 6 hours. And he said, right, we're losing money on that now. You're now doing that for free. So that was a real kind of education. And I suddenly realized, yeah, okay, this creative business doesn't fit in time boxes. It's not a 9 to 5. So I thought either I send this as it is, or I take it home and I do it in my own time and I finish it, you know. So that was a first kind of taste of something that I've always been really fascinated by, which is the transfer of ideas into cash, into money, time, what it costs, that kind of thing, which is really at the heart of how any design works, whether you're in-house, whether you're agency. It's all about that transference of an idea into value, into, you know, pay, if you like. And then from there, I moved to Spain. It's a bit of a long story, but I went to Ibiza, and this was mid-90s. It was incredible over there at the time. I had this revelation in Cafe Del Mar. I don't think I'm the first person who's had a vision outside Cafe Del Mar. But I saw a couple of kids running around on the seafront, and they were two little blonde kids. I took a picture of them, and I've still got it. And I heard their parents calling them, and one of them was calling in English and one of them was calling in Spanish. And at that point, I'd just completely fallen in love with the climate and everything. I'd never left Cornwall, really. And I said, I want that. I would love to be, you know, that family. And I went back to Brighton and I met my wife, who was Spanish. I don't want to talk about manifesting here, but, you know, I think we might get onto this later on. We talk about how to build a career. But I think a big part of it is fixing this idea in your head of where you want to be, not in terms of a career specifically or skills and that kind of thing. Just what kind of life do you want to have, you know? So just, again, by serendipity, I met my wife, who was Spanish. We've been married now for 30 years. We moved to Madrid because I really wanted to go and live in Spain. And we had two blonde kids who looked exactly like the two that I saw on the seafront, Cap del Mar. And I went to Madrid, and I literally walked into a studio, again, knocked on the door. And I think I was talking to a studio in Barcelona called Versava, who became really massive. And I do sometimes think, if I'd gone there instead of Madrid, but actually it all worked out really well. And I went to a studio in Madrid, knocked on the door. By chance, again, the studio director, Phil, it was a small studio. It was about 12 designers, mostly editorial, but also some brand design. He was a big fan of, creating an international team. And he had an English designer who'd been working there. He was a big Anglophile, lots of respect for English design in Spain, which was really interesting. And his English designer had left. So he was like, yeah, you know, when can you start? And I said, oh, he said, do you know Quark Express? And I was like, yeah, I know Quark Express. Never used it before. And he said, you know, you can start next week. So I went home. I had a pirate copy of Quark Express on a CD, whacked it in my iMac and taught myself, or at least I thought I did, Quark Express in a day. And then there I was. So I joined the studio. I was doing annual reports, gradually properly learned Quark Express. And that was a really interesting experience, quite apart from living in another country. We had two kids. We lived right in the center of Madrid. Amazing time. And it was just over a decade. So I did actually want to move on from the studio at one point, but it's very hard. We'll talk about that probably. Yeah, still in Madrid. We might talk about that when we talk about differences between work in different countries, but it was very much a place where you would take a role somewhere and it was just taken as a given that you would stay. It wasn't a very fluid kind of, you know, work environment. So I stayed there for over 10 years, then moved back to the UK. And I freelanced for a bit in the Southwest. We moved to the Southwest. It was going to be either Bristol or Bath. And because we'd gone from the center of Madrid, we wanted to find somewhere a little bit countryside for the kids. So we ended up in Bath. And I freelanced around a few studios and then ended up at a studio that specialized, very small studio, specialized in branding for startups. And I worked there as design director, became creative director. And then I was kind of itchy feet. I wanted to try something different. And I think in all of the different positions that I've had, I've worked in all kinds of studios, big, small. From the first partnership, I worked as design director in a bigger, more traditional agency with a structure of account directors and that kind of thing.
Was that Mr. B?
Yeah. So that was before this startup branding agency.
Just for context for listeners, Mr. B and Friends are an agency that are quite local to us here in the city of Bristol. Our founder knows their founder really well. They go on agency away days and stuff like that. Both been in the industry for a long time. Good bunch.
Yeah, they're doing really well at the moment. So I was kind of interested in what's the perfect model, because everything's got some good and bad things, but there doesn't seem to be anything that still really hits the nail on the head for me in terms of how you turn creative into a force in a business. And I think I gradually started to become a bit disillusioned with agencies, where there was one particular client that I worked with. There was a software company in Bristol, and we did a rebrand for them. And I remember the presentation. I used to love presenting creative concepts, And at this point, it was all in person. It was pre-COVID. And we did all the usual, this is what the brand could look like on a billboard in Times Square, all that nice stuff that you like, and blow your socks off kind of stuff in the creative presentation. I remember they were like, but what we really want is a Google Slides template. And I was like, the usual kind of thing. I will leave that to the in-house people to figure out. We're going to deliver this shiny brand. And it just kept bugging me. And in the end, we got someone into a freelancer who knew how to make Google Slide templates. But the seed was already there, in that we hadn't really solved the problem. We'd given them a brand, but we hadn't solved the problem. And that was when I started to think about in-house. And again, by coincidence, along came COVID. I'd left the studio at the time to go back to freelance. And then COVID came along and I lost all of my freelance clients overnight. And I didn't work for about 2 months, but I taught myself motion graphics. So I did a motion graphics course. I was always really interested in that. I thought that was an area that was coming up on the horizon. It'd be really interesting to go into. And again, by chance, a friend of mine that I'd met in Madrid, who was working for a Danish fintech, said, look, do you want to come and work in-house? We're a small business. We've got sales and marketing team in London, all the engineers in Denmark, CEO's Danish company. And we really want to build out a design team, and we want to bring design into the business. Would you be interested? And I said, well, as it happens, yeah, I would. And I think there was another job that I went for at the same time, and I had to kind of choose between the two. And I went with the in-house because I thought this is just too good, too coincidental to pass up, And that was that. And that was my first introduction to startup life, which was like a bomb that went off. I was like, this is the thing, this is so perfect for me and for the way I think I could do everything. There's no. Did
you not
brand.
have any kind of any reservations about the volatility of startup life, or was it just kind of, this is it?
Yeah,
I'm in for this.
Yeah, I did a bit, and I think it's still a thing. I mean, I work at Carta now. It's a big company. It's a big US corporate, but it still moves in the currents of startups. And like you say, volatility is a thing. But to be honest, when I freelanced for 2 years, and I never had work more than about 2 weeks in advance. And I had a mortgage and I had kids, and work just always came, always did. And people that I spoke to at the time and that I've spoken to since then just thought that was a crazy. This, like, how did you sleep at night? But I think once you,
to be honest, that fills me with slight terror. To be honest, that might.
Yeah, well, it fills me with terror thinking about it now. But it just, sometimes I would get towards the end of a week, and I didn't have anything booked for the following week. And then suddenly on Thursday, I'd get a call. Hey, are you free next week? Yeah, I am. And it was like that. And I think I was always confident. I had enough studios that I worked in that I was always confident that one of them would come through with a job, you know. But I didn't ever have an agent. It was all word of mouth
Hmm.
or calling people, and I always found that once I got in somewhere, I would get repeat bookings. And I know why I got repeat bookings now, because I've worked with freelancers since then, so I know how I used to work. So I kind of, yeah, it's interesting. Going back to Spain, for example, Spain was a job for life culture, and that was true of design studios as well. It was generally, but it was true of design studios. I worked with people in the studio I worked in Madrid who'd been there for 20, 30 years, and they weren't going anywhere. They were going to retire there, you know.
Yeah, we just one of our senior motion designers left last Friday, and he'd have been with the agency for 12 years. It was an emotional day. But
Yeah,
yeah, we've got a few lifers here, so I know where you're coming from there.
yeah. I think that for a lot of people was the ideal. There was a really interesting survey at the time with young Spanish people that everyone treated as a national crisis, that their top aspirational job was a civil servant, because in Spain, all kinds of levels of, you know, civil servants, there were departments on top of departments, and you clocked in and you clocked out, and a lot of the time didn't have to do any work. You were just paid, and no one could fire you. You couldn't, you know. So I didn't like that. I experienced that, and a lot of people would say, "Oh, wouldn't it be great to have a job where you've got job security forever? You know, you go into a job and you know that." But it's not necessarily, for me anyway. It doesn't give me a lot of satisfaction. And on the flip side, that embracing of uncertainty gives you a little bit of an edge that I think makes things a bit more interesting. But yeah, I think the startup world is pretty brutal, and it's very fickle, and it's very up and down. But, you know, people describe it as a roller coaster ride, and I suppose it is in a way. You know, the time that it burns really bright, and you get to do some incredible work. And just the building of the team. You know, I was a one man band in some respects, and I was kind of like, hey, what's our brand strategy? We don't have one. Okay, I'll make a brand strategy. What are our values, and what's the mission and purpose? We don't have it. Right, let's do that.
Hmm.
So I was able to jump into everything, which I really like. It goes back to the, you know, the record cover with the type. I like to fiddle around with everything in a way. And then, you know, it was good times. It was 2021, a lot of money around, a lot of investment. So startups had big budgets, everything was good. And we really got to experiment with remote first hiring as well. And it was the boom of remote hiring. And we were suddenly looking around the world. We had hires in Canada, hires all over Europe. And I hired a web developer in Ghana, which was great. And at that time, again, because of budgets and that kind of thing, it was fixed salary. So the going rate for a web developer, wherever you were in the world, was the going rate of London. Like, it was a top salary. So my web developer in Ghana was earning more than the Ghanaian president. And yeah, fantastic. I mean, challenges of working with someone in Ghana who had a intermittent, you know, Wi-Fi signal.
Mm.
And
I
I
mean, you can
remember,
afford some decent Wi-Fi.
yeah, well, we had some company expense cards which he got sent, and we had kind of equipment budgets. So I said, well, go out and get yourself a, you know, desk and a chair and laptop, all the rest of it. And he said, oh well, I've got to find somewhere that will. I said to him, oh, you just need to put your receipt in and etc. And he said, well, I need to find somewhere that will give me a receipt, because you don't generally get receipts, you know. Um, so that was really interesting. And yeah, the remote working thing, we spent a lot of time and effort on company culture. One of the things that I ended up doing a lot of, which I was quite surprised about, was probably 50% of my time was on internal creative for the team, like employer branding, that kind of thing. Every quarter, I used to do a remote event with the CMO at the time, got together and said, look, we need to do something more than just a slides presentation of our targets. We need to make this a thing. So we did these incredible themed quarterly kickoffs that were based on a movie theme. We did one that was all based around Ocean's 11 and hustling. And we had a virtual casino night where everyone was dressed up in suits. And it was probably the best work function I've ever been to. And I was sat in my bedroom, wearing a suit with a cocktail. But we really, really pushed that whole remote culture button, really hard.
And that's quite interesting though, because you've gone from working in a vibrant Madrid studio, where everyone's together every day, and I think you mentioned when we met for coffee, the office shuts down on Fridays and everybody starts cooking steak and drinking red wine, and that's amazing. And you've gone from that to working remotely with people around the world in different time zones. And am I right in saying, just from what you said there, that you didn't really have you've not had a period in your in-house career where you've been, not working remotely, basically. So you've kind of gone from one extreme to another. How have you found that? And obviously you mentioned some examples there of where you've kind of used certain kind of creative tactics to kind of bring people together around a kind of common theme and topic and stuff. But on the whole, has that just been a culture shift that you've just kind of got on board with and rolled with, or have there been any kind of times where you've maybe thought, do you know what, I wish we could get together more often. I wish this could be more of an in-person thing.
Yeah, it's a good question, I think, because it does seem to be like two completely different worlds. But for me, it's been kind of seamless, and it feels in many ways the same to me. I think that works for me because of the stage I'm at of the career. I've done the office thing. I was a freelancer where I would drop into random offices and I would sit down at a desk in the middle of a bunch of people who knew each other and do work, that was a very strange kind of situation. And I've done that, and I've done the bigger office, I've done the smaller studios. So I've kind of taken what I need from all of that. But I think if I was younger, that's where it starts to get really difficult. People who haven't experienced that, because there is a lot of benefit in that.
Yeah.
I think for me now, for where I'm at in my career, this works really well for me. I've just come back from an offsite in New York. That was great. So we got the whole marketing team together, and I probably do 2 or 3 trips a year to the States. When I used to work because the reason that I'm working for the States is because the Danish company got acquired
I was
by
going to ask
Carta.
you about that, actually, yeah.
Yeah. So I literally shifted from working for a Danish London-based company to working for a US company without moving.
And actually, on that, can I just ask, so again, sorry, I'm interrupting a little bit, but I'm just...
No, that's okay.
That's okay. I do apologise. So you've worked for British studios, you've worked for a Madrid studio, you've worked for a Danish company, you've worked for a US company, and you've done a few bits in between. Just in terms of cultural differences, are there any that are kind of quite glaring, especially where you are now working for a US business? And we know shaped by very well the way that US businesses like to work. It's fascinating stuff, but it is a little bit different maybe to other environments.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing is, when I worked in Spain, I think and this is true of anyone who moves to another country, you learn about a new culture, but you also learn a lot more about your own culture because you're removed from it. And that, I probably thought about being English and having an upbringing in this country just as much as I was assimilating all the new stuff in Spain. And I realized that we've got an incredible culture of innovation in this country. We can move. I mean, my career in Spain probably wouldn't have worked because there isn't that same fluidity. It's not normal to kind of move from one place to another. My dad's bit of advice, he had a couple of bits of advice when I was younger. One of them was, don't ever do anything just because everyone else is doing it. And that kind of tied into, I think that the whole idea of restlessness and moving around, and I think the UK is a powerhouse for that stuff, and it's ingrained in our culture, and culture plays a big part of how how businesses within a country will operate.
Hmm.
Spain, on the other hand, when I went there, very different, very rigid. Everyone did everything that everyone else did. That's as a sort of culture, and
Wow,
that's
really? Yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting in a lot of ways. When there was a demo, and there were a lot of demos when I was in Madrid, a lot of demonstrations in the street. We had the Atocha bombs. They happened just down the road from my flat. That was incredible experience to be a part of, and that was just before 9/11. There were demos after that, which I'll never forget. I mean, millions of people on the street. If there was a demo in Spain, everyone was there. We're going to the demo because everyone's going to the demo. And then in this country, when you have a demo, people are more like, well, I'm not going to go because I'm not, that is much more of an individual culture,
Yeah.
whereas over there, lots of reasons for it that are too complex to get into. But you really felt part of a community. I mean, I remember the COVID masks were a big thing. COVID masks here, some people wore them, some people didn't, some people agreed, some people didn't. I was going to Spain at the same time. Everybody was wearing a COVID mask. Everyone was wearing a face covering. And I went to a village in the middle of nowhere, and there were people wearing masks who were walking around, who'd stand 10 meters away from you. And I wasn't wearing a mask at that point because I decided, that it was but yeah, so someone said to me at the same time, well, the problem in Spain is going to be someone's going to need to tell everyone to take them off, or they'll just wear them forever. But there's something great about a community that moves together.
Hmm.
So the individualism, yeah, great, it drives innovation, that kind of thing. But sometimes that community thing is missing. And I've got a bit off track here talking about the different cultures, but
Well, I'm interested
in
in how it plays out kind of with the US way of working as well, because
yeah,
I feel like it's not so much. Well, I mean, in our experience anyway, it's not so much. I suppose it is a community thing in a way. Obviously, the US is a much bigger country, quite a bit more kind of, I suppose, diversity. But what we found of our American counterparts is that there is a common drive, that seems to be to a person, and sometimes they're a little bit maligned for it in a way, not taking holiday, working all the hours of sends and things like that. But have you found that as well? Have you had to kind of, does that fit with your ethos as well in terms of that sheer drive and that drive to win and that drive to get things done?
yeah, I think so. I think the competitive side. I think if you're, I've said this before to designers in my team, we're competing all the time. It's a competition. This isn't like turn up and express yourself artistically. And I think a business is not beholden to give you a salary in order for you to find an outlet for your creative expression. A business
And
wants
in the
you to
US, they won't.
solve. No,
There's
exactly,
a
yeah,
firing culture that, if you're not performing, you're out. I mean, it's obviously more difficult over here in the UK. So
absolutely,
that might have
yeah.
held us back a little bit from a startup point of view, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe. I think not to the
Well, I
extreme
don't
that,
think
like,
that, but yeah.
yeah, not to the extreme of Spain, for example. It's very hard to get fired in Spain. Very hard. Once you're in a role, you're in a role, and that's it. The Danish, for example, have got an interesting mix of that. They're very pragmatic, and they've got a very straightforward approach to business, the same as the Americans have. If you're not performing, you're out. But at the same time, they've got a very personable, warm side. I think that the big difference, I'm really impressed with. I don't want to have to choose country here, okay?
No, no,
But
I'm not
what
asking you.
doesn't surprise me at all, for example, that Copenhagen's powerhouse of startups and innovation, they're very good at being very relaxed and very on it at the same time. They've found that balance really well. So, for example, you will be given a budget, and you'll be trusted to do whatever is necessary with that budget to get the job done. Whereas I think in the States, it's harder to get hold of a budget, and the budget will be controlled more by other levels of the business. For example, you can suddenly find yourself in a position, and again, I'm not generalizing here, I'm talking about my personal experience. I don't want to start talking about countries this and countries that, but I found myself in a position where I was entrusted with a lot working for the Danish company. The founders would say, well, you want to do this? We'll do it then. We've hired you to do this job. I'm like, okay, so I can go away and do, hi, yeah, carry on. It's got to work, but do whatever you think is best. But I think the diktats of business are really interesting. I mean, yeah, like we said, it can be really brutal and it can be really harsh, and there are reductions in force and that kind of thing. We've been through a series of layoffs. Other businesses have. Everyone has, and it's really, really tough. And I think there's a lot of pressure that comes from that, and especially like pressure of overperformance.
Yeah.
And that can be a thing. We wanted to start talking about burnout and that kind of thing. I think that especially, I don't think it even relates to remote or in office, but I think that there's a lot of pressure to perform. And if you're not able to handle yourself, then that can go off the rails a little bit. If you're heavily influenced by, if you don't have a good idea about your own course and what you do that's valuable, then that can be really difficult, I think, especially for younger, more inexperienced designers.
Yeah. I mean, actually, one thing that I wanted to kind of explore with you is, so obviously, your career journey is fascinating. I'd love to know if you've met anyone else with a similar kind of squiggly career journey, but I'm sure it's from the people that I've spoken to in your position, it tends to be a bit more uniform than that. So it's really, really fascinating. It's obviously given you a unique perspective on the landscape, but it's been a kind of a lengthy career journey as such. So, and obviously you've seen a lot of change, I suppose. Imagine, we've already talked about, in-house versus remote working, or kind of in-office versus remote working. But I just wondered whether, talking from a perspective of kind of, like you were saying, like design roles from junior to senior, the demands on those roles now compared to maybe in years gone by, from your perspective, what does that kind of look like now? And how have the demands of those roles kind of changed, as not only have you've kind of expanded your experience within them, but obviously as kind of the landscape's changed.
Yeah, something I think about a lot. I mentor a few young designers, and I've always put some, time and effort into that, because I know how hard it is to get started. And I think probably having had to just figure things out for myself, I feel that wherever I can give anyone a bit of advice or help, then I'm more than happy to. It's really tough, and I don't know. The thing that I did of going and knocking on doors, it's not the done thing anymore. It's difficult. I think there's a lot more. The office environment, so going back to this thing of the hybrid or remote, the office environment will give younger designers much better protection. I think it will ease them into work and the principles of work a lot more easily. You will go for drinks after work with your friends, talk about things that have happened, you talk things out. I think it's a safer environment, I think, when you're younger and you're trying to figure things out, and you're dealing with the whole flow of business and how it works. Remote can be really difficult especially if you're going to be laid off, and you're laid off on a remote call, and then you're deactivated, and there you are sat in your house. That's really tough.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it's incumbent on businesses to look after their designers. I spend a lot of time with my team talking about the designer mindset. So I do these sessions with designer mindset, and we talk about the pressures. They're not. We work inside a marketing team. We're not marketers. We don't have the marketing mindset. We need to connect with them as part of the job, because we need to deliver stuff for them. But you can often forget that if you're a creative or a designer, you think slightly differently. So, when we have these mindset sessions, it's all about that. It's all about saying, look, you might be thinking this, and that's fine, that's normal. You might be challenged by this or by that other kind of aspect of the job. But I think it depends a lot on the company as well. So the company where I work, we have things like unlimited leave. We don't have X days of vacation. I find that whole idea of, I've always struggled with that, to be honest. You will have 20 days holiday. And I've always thought maybe it comes from that thing going back to my dad and not having the boss. And I thought, I'll decide how many days I get. I'll do the job for you and you pay me and I'll decide my time off. So I think with the unlimited leave, it's such a great system. You need brilliant people in roles who are just left to get on with the job, and they should be able to manage their time.
Obviously you've got people around the world. Are there disparities in how much leave they take? Like, do some people not take very much and some people take a little bit more?
No, not really. There's an interesting thing with so my team. There's a designer in San Francisco, New York, Valencia as well in Spain, and we've all got things like different national holidays. So there'll be Thanksgiving. So we just have Thanksgiving in the States.
Yeah.
And then the designer that works in Valencia, she'll have the Spanish fiestas. There's a lot of Spanish fiestas. The Spanish do bank holidays really well. So there's a bit of disparity there, but no, it works fine. It works fine. I think I've always found the whole idea of like the 20 days leave. The problem with that is you always get towards the end of a cycle and people have just got time they haven't taken. So suddenly everyone's taken a week off. It's a nuts system. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So it's that whole thing. If you relax those controls, people do the right thing, and people make a sensible choice. So it all works out really well. But I think one of the things at Carta, I remember one of the first jobs I did a campaign, and it was crazy work for a week, long hours, and then at the end of it, my manager said, next week you're taking 2 days off, take Monday and Tuesday off. So you've now got a 4-day weekend. No one had ever said that to me in all of the studios I've worked, in all the places I've ever been. No one ever said, you've done a bunch of hard work, now just take some days off. And that's the culture that we have. And that is great. I've worked at places where they push and they push and they push, and they just want more all the time. And that's not sustainable. That's no way to run a team.
Yeah. So do you think that the demands of the role, just talking about, obviously, especially for juniors, the demands of the role are more mental than kind of talent-based, if you like, or have the demands changed from a kind of brand, what's expected? Because obviously, you look at, even in the last few years, you talk about motion design, for instance, and suddenly now motion is kind of embedded into pretty much everywhere from a brand identity point of view, that a brand has to live and breathe. Whereas even a few years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case, especially in B2B. So have the demands changed from a kind of skill set point of view as well, or is it more mental?
I think it's a bit of both, really. I think in terms of the tools and that kind of thing, there's much less of a division. I think one of the things with remote working, there's less of a division between home life and work life, personal issues and work issues. And the way that I talk to my team, very much involved in anything that's going on in your life that has an effect on work. Let's talk about it and let's work something out. If you need time to dedicate to a particular personal issue, then go and do it. And then, if it's affecting the work, then we can talk about it. So I don't think that it's possible anymore to have that division of, when people turn up to the office, I don't want to know about their home life. That's home life. This is office life. They're one and the same environments now, whether you're working. I don't think there are many businesses that have gone back to 100% office life. So you're going to be talking about people who are spending at least half the week at home. So I think that that incorporation of people's personal lives and situation, everything else is really important to sort of bring into work. I think what's really interesting at the moment is, and where there's a big opportunity in terms of, going back to the whole in-house and agency debate and that kind of thing. If there was one thing that I would say is big future-wise, it's collaboration. So collaboration is a big, big, big thing. And what every single business does badly is collaboration. There are holes in every business where that should be happening.
And you talking purely internal or internal and external kind of
both? Both, yeah. And I think that the opportunity for agencies is to solve that problem. Internally, companies need to think more about how they can collaborate between business units and between squads and between departments, whatever it is. And agencies can think more about how they can collaborate with businesses better.
But is this a result of remote working, do you think, or do you think it's just a symptom that's been kind of bubbling under anyway? I think businesses grow and develop and get a bit more diverse and in geography and whatever.
Yeah, I think again it's a bit of both. I mean, you could have a corporation, a big corporate with a big office, physical office, where everyone's working 5 days a week, and the guys on the floor upstairs are still going to be disconnected from the team downstairs. So it's not so much to do with whether you're in a physical office space or not. But I think one of the interesting things with startups, small startups are so powerful because collaboration is everything. You've got a vision, the founder's had, maybe he's got a partner, whatever, and then you get your engineers. You're probably in a kitchen or something, or a small office, and that collaboration is natural. If you've got your guy in sales, he's sat around the other side of the table, you're listening into his sales call. So those ideas are flying, as part of the natural setup of your business. And as businesses get bigger and they start to divide into business units and teams and departments, silos are a natural, they're like a magnet. People just pull naturally into silos. Silos aren't a decision that people are like, hey, let's all have separate ideas and let's come up with separate things. It's something that happens. So you need to really work against that. And that's where the company culture comes in. My wife used to work in American Express, and they had a team called business engineering, a whole department, and it was all about going around the business and finding those points where silos are happening and fixing them, whether it's, reducing meetings or setting up meetings between two opposite teams or whatever it might be. So I think companies that can solve that problem, and it's not a tech issue. A lot of the time it's a call, and a lot of the good stuff of the collaboration.
Tech should make it easier.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't a lot of the time, because I think it's the same with AI. People want to solve the tech problems and the process problems. They don't want to deal with the human problems, because they're hard. They're harder. If you've got someone who doesn't get on with someone, they're not going to collaborate, But then how do you hire two people who are going to get on? Again, it comes back to company culture. But I think, especially in our team, we're constantly reaching out to people across the business and talking to them, whether it's sales, it's marketing or product.
And is that part of the way that you build your team, kind of to encourage them to do that proactively off their own backs? Is that something that you kind of build into your team's kind of mindset?
Yeah.
I had this conversation recently, actually, with a couple of designers who actually, they might give this designer, a certain team to kind of build a relationship with. Might be product marketing, might give another designer, a different team like content marketing to build a relationship with. And actually they own that relationship and they feed back. So sometimes it's quite a conscious decision. Other times it's just more of a kind of, let's make sure we're doing this on a regular basis and we need to be proactive about it, but ultimately we'll do it as a team kind of thing. How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to people. I don't think there's any business process, again, like American Express and business engineering. You can't process your way out of that problem. It's people. Is whether do I want to get on a call with the product designer to talk about, aligning the icons in product with the icons in marketing. If I like the guy and we get on really well, absolutely. And I think as well, it depends on what's the main drive of your designer. If you're hiring a designer who loves to illustrate all day long, he's not going to be interested in speaking to anyone in marketing about how to improve leads to the funnel. If you're hiring a designer who really loves the vision of the company and loves to solve problems, then yes, they are going to do that because they want the company to succeed. It's different objectives really, but it starts. You've got to hire the people who want to do that. Some people just do. They naturally want to do more and they want to go outside their remit, you know. And it's, I think the silo breaking a lot of the time is going outside your remit. It's those little chats. I guess it's what people call the water cooler moments that everyone says were. I don't think I've ever been anywhere near a water cooler. But yeah, this thing like, we missed the water cooler moments with remote. You can still have them, you know. And I think that's what they are. They're the things that are outside of your immediate remit that you do, the extra that you give. And I think that if you can get those things to work in a business, it can be really, really powerful.
Well, actually, that's a good point, actually. And we are coming to the end of our time. I mean, I could talk for another hour, to be honest. It's been such a riveting conversation. And actually, we haven't touched on some of the things that I really wanted to touch on, which is a bit of a shame. Maybe we'll do a part 2 sometime. But just on that point about going outside your remit, the question I kind of wanted to end with was, what do you have any advice for? So I know that you've really focused on building teams and, as you say, mentoring people up and coming. But do you have any advice for kind of aspiring designers wanting to get into the industry? Maybe apart from going and knocking on doors, because we said that that's probably not a thing anymore. But anyone looking to make their way in this kind of crazy world of design and branding, is there any advice that you would give to them?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing is don't be put off and don't be sort of disheartened. I think there are all these people and say, oh, you know, so competitive. There's so many people out there. There was one of the things really interesting. Like when you look at jobs on LinkedIn, it will tell you the number of applicants for a job, and you'll see like this really cool job and say 300 applicants. Straight away, you're going to think, how can I compete with 300 people? Of those 300 applicants, there's probably about 15 that are in the running. So you're competing with 15 people. So don't be disheartened. I think that the main thing is it's really, really, really exciting time in brand and creative. Probably, you know, through my career, I'm the most excited by what's happening at the moment. It feels like there's new frontiers everywhere. You know, there are roles that are going to appear that people have never imagined before. There are going to be new roles, new ways of working. I think the most important thing is don't worry about the tools and don't worry about the specifics and don't think, I should do this course or I should do that course. I should learn about AI because that's what's coming. I think you need to, the advice that I would give is sit down and have a conversation with yourself about what you really love doing. You know, not specifics, just general. What do you want to do in the future? Do you want to be living in a different climate? Do you want to be, you know, things like that? Do you want to give things to people? Do you want to express yourself creatively? What's your thing? And I think if you can figure out what that is, it takes a long time. It's not going to be instant, but all you've got to do is take the first step. You don't have to have it all solved. You know, I've always thought those things of when I was 15, I was at school. I had a careers advisor. No one told me that I was going to this guy's office, and he said, "Right then, Breckon, what do you want to do with your life?" And I thought, wow, that's kind of, you know, you're a careers advisor. How did that work out for you? You know, I think that idea of you have to have things figured out. You know, anyone says, what do you want to do with your life? Walk away. You know, no. So you need to really figure out, it's very personal. You need to figure out yourself. There's no right way or wrong way to do it. It's just, you know, your way that is personal to you. And it's got to be really, really personal and it's got to be true to you. And I think if you can figure that out, even the first step, then you're on the path to doing something that you love. And if you do something you love, you'll get really good at it. And if you get good at it, you'll be valuable. And I think that's probably the best thing.
Yeah, that's perfect advice. I went to my careers advisor and said, I think I want to be a paramedic. And he asked me a few more questions, put them into his little computer system and said, it spat out farmer. So I think that's what he
Yeah, that's
didn't become a paramedic or a farmer.
Amazing.
So how wrong was he? But that's really, really good advice. I've been talking to my son, but he's only 8, but he talks a bit about what he wants to do when he grows up. And I just said, look, you don't have to make that decision now. You don't have to make that decision in 10 years' time. You probably don't even have to make that decision really in 15 years' time. In your early 20s, just figure out what you love doing, what you're good at, to a certain extent what makes money, obviously, and then just go from there. So I think that's really, really good advice. But listen, Dave,
do what you
thank you so much for spending time with me on the Changemakers podcast.
Been a pleasure.
Amazing conversation. Your career is so fascinating. And as I said, I would love to do a part 2 in future and talk a little bit more about. I think actually one thing we didn't get into was your work at Carta at the moment, and in particular, the difference that you're finding in kind of not even startup life now. Obviously, Carta are a bit more established. I mean, some would say they're a startup, but I'd really, really love to get into all of that with you. And it's a shame that we didn't have time to do it this time. But listen, thank you so much for being a great guest. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks once again for being a guest on the Changemakers podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Dave.